Howdy, howdy friends, welcome back to the RimWorld Steampunk Samurai series, where, my friends, currently we have a very large mess to clean up. As I'm sure you remember, at the end of last episode, we had a gigantic invasion by mechanoids right after being invaded by space mercenaries that had already crippled our defenses as well as our samurai, and thus we got destroyed. The vast majority of our samurai, as well as our samurai allies from the Black Shogun clan, are currently healing up in the hospital, including Kona Yoshimaru herself. But as you also may remember, not all of our samurai were quite as lucky as she, and they didn't quite make it through the intense battle. Last episode we had lost Jiraiya and Hakuo, and thus we will now be building their sarcophagi to bury them in. In our crypt, of course, as this is the most respectable place alongside our other fallen warriors. As is our tradition, we would also engrave artwork on both of their burial sites. Jiraiya's sarcophagus would be engraved with him taking down one of his foes from a few years ago, but he was quite distressed and also very reluctant to do so, possibly hinting at his more kind nature. The artwork on Hakuo's sarcophagus was a bit more depressing, as it was actually a representation of his murder and death. A much different way of seeing the battle that night from his perspective. Even the toughest of warriors can feel very lonely in their last moments. With our friends finally put to rest, though, it was time that we handle a very pressing issue. Our caravan has finally arrived at the item stash with the Ruby Dragon Priest mask that we believe may be associated with the large creature blocking out the sun. Slowly and cautiously, we would have our tank begin maneuvering between these small hills as we approach the item stash itself. There seemed to be some type of ancient soldier guarding the complex, though they weren't actually part of any faction, especially not the space mercenaries, which was the most puzzling part, as their armor was just as advanced. Enough contemplating though, as they're blasting our tank. And they seem to be pretty impervious to our blast damage, probably for the best if we try to run them over. Thankfully, the tank only managed to incapacitate her, so Zatachi can go about tending to her wounds, while Atsui and Senju go in towards the mask. It didn't seem all that special, just a normal mask. We simply picked it up and began walking outside, but I did realize that the sun was beginning to come back out. Perhaps the two events truly were connected, or perhaps it was just a coincidence. I suppose time will tell. Meanwhile, back home, everyone was finally back up on their feet, and they were beginning to try to repair our tanks as best they could. For you see, my friends, we still have a mech cluster that we need to deal with. Sure, the majority of the mechanoids have been destroyed, but they do have mech assemblers there, as well as a psychic droner, which is going to be a problem. Before we deal with that, though, we have a few other matters to attend to, like the fact that our slave, Brim, was actually killed during the battle with the mechanoids as well, something that I hadn't noticed, and I actually feel pretty bad about. Less that he died, as he died an honorable death, but more about that I completely forgot. So to make it up to him, even in his death, as well as to give him a proper honorable burial, we actually ended up burying him in our crypt with the others. The art that was engraved on his sarcophagus was pretty abstract, a circle surrounded by squares with some other artistic details. Perhaps, though, he was the only slave among us all who fought as bravely as any other warrior, being the circle, and all of our samurai being the squares. I'm not really sure though. And as if the Dragon Priest mask couldn't get any stranger, we ended up having a large meteorite that fell just on the outside of our village walls. This meteorite just so happened to be completely made up of a dense composite of rubies, the same material that the mask is made of, if I'm correct. And I am. Weird? Sure, but they are rubies nonetheless, and we need those for our turret, so we'll mine it. While we're waiting on our caravan and our other tank to arrive back home though, we would now bide our time and try to heal up all of our wounds as best we could and begin repairing the tanks and defenses that we do currently have back home. While we were doing that, we were also scrounging up enough silver to have some settlers go out and settle 2 brand new villages for us under our clan. Now these did cost us a pretty penny to settle, but the majority majority of the cost actually was funded by the taxes that we've been receiving thus far. Now, these two new villages don't really have any mountains, or at least not enough for us to make any little mining towns out of them, so we're actually going to begin making some logging camps as well as some hunting and trapping camps. That way we can try to sell all of the logs and lumber as well as the furs that we get. Speaking of villages, I've been asking you guys for some names for some of them, and I haven't gotten all that many name suggestions for the villages themselves, but we did get one for our very first village that we settled, and we are going to be naming it Lazarus Rivet. And since our clan has been expanding ever more, I've decided to actually give it a proper name that is befitting an actual clan, and we're going to be known as the Lazarian Shogunate. And finally, we have a wonderful name for our tortoise that is going to be Kuzimbo. All of these splendid names have been suggested by our friends Michael-P7X6Y, T-Jice Rules 7651, and Seamus Finnegan 1164, so thank you all three for these wonderful names. The name for the village Lazarus Rivet being in reference to a rivet in the road, and of course in honor of Lazarus himself, and the name of the shogunate being the Lazarian Shogunate, a mix of our previous faction name with the shogunate, of course, since we are a proper clan now. And finally, Kuzimbo the turtle's name is actually the king of Kapas, I believe is how you pronounce it. They appear to be a water spirit based on what I can find online. All of these some extremely wonderful names, so thank you all once again. Some time later, and our caravan had also finally returned home with our ruby dragon mask, a few weapons, as well as our prisoner. Izumi here was quite the fighter, as you can see with her melee and shooting capabilities, and she also had a burning passion for intellectual work and medical. So we'll go ahead and begin trying to recruit her, as she'll be a wonderful addition to the clan. Now then though, finally with everyone back home and our tanks ready, it's time for us to add the last nail to the coffin of this mech cluster. We had some visitors in the area who were currently catching their attention, or at least their turret's attention for the time being, which gave us an ample opportunity to sneak up in the night. Using our two tanks to spearhead this little invasion, we would quickly put a final stop to the cluster. Not gonna lie, I kind of expected that to be a lot more difficult than it actually was, but after defeating the mech cluster, we began trying to haul a lot of different things that needed to be hauled, as well as just trying to get organized before we really got back on our feet. It was during this period of organization that Aoshiro had formed a relationship with Retz. Realistically, a bittersweet moment. I was happy that Aoshiro had managed to find some type of relationship. Given her race, I realized that this is important for a psychic bond and whatnot, and that they are some of the greatest lovers in the universe, but I was sad to see that she had already found someone so soon after Jiraiya. During this time though, we were also smashing as many mechs as we possibly could for their sweet metallic resources. Since they tried to kill us, it's only fair that we use their internal components to rebuild our society. One of our first structures that we would end up repairing and rebuilding was our recreation hall with our mahjong tables. Now this may not seem like the best place to start, but without our recreation, everyone's going to be quite bored and quite pissed off. Shortly thereafter, we also managed to recruit Rusty and enslaved Kron. Just to refresh your memory, both of them were space mercenaries that had attacked us last episode. Now, with their help, they can assist us with rebuilding our village. First and foremost, rebuilding our research laboratory with our steampunk research bench and our normal research bench as well. And of course, the additional filing cabinets to help us speed up our research. Using some of our steel and components alongside with many of the tank parts from our destroyed tanks, we would end up building yet another Emperor's Wrath tank. The first step in completely rebuilding our fleet. And luckily for me, we just so happen to already have a name picked out. We're going to be naming this tank Laz's Vengeance. This wonderful name suggestion comes from our good friend CT-Clone, who actually said that this name would be for another Altered Comrade tank, but unfortunately, I'm not sure when the next time we're going to build one is, and thus why I've given the name to an Emperor's Wrath tank. I hope that's alright. Something that is definitely not alright is that Retz ended up proposing to Aoshiro, and she ended up rejecting his proposal. He was so devastated by this that the two of them have now broken up. If you don't like my opinion on the situation, I think because Aoshiro is a high mate, basically due to her race and genetics, she has to have some type of mate, but she still hasn't quite gotten over Jiraiya. pariah. He was her one true love, and no one will ever be able to take that spot, and thus she was not ready for such a commitment. Again, just my opinion after some speculation. Now then, with the recent expansions of our empire, we're making quite a bit of silver in taxes. Now, I would like to use these taxes to put back into the empire to expand it further by settling 2 brand new villages, both of which would end up being settled in forest and rainforest, and thus they too will be logging camps, and thus earning us quite a bit of taxes once more. They should easily pay themselves off after a few months. We did also have a war merchant coming from the Black Shogun clan though, and thus we would end up selling them plenty of weapons and armor, which would also help us pay off our debt for settling these new villages much faster. It was merely a drop in the bucket, but every little bit counts, of course. Now then, while we're waiting on them to build their logging camps and deforestation camps, as well as pay their taxes, I thought it might be a good idea for us to go ahead and begin upgrading our defenses. First, we're going to be starting off with the western walls and entrance. Using slate blocks, we would end up expanding and doubling up on our walls, adding in 2 more clockwork turrets, as well as utilizing much of our steel to go about making bear traps instead of wooden spike traps. As we were working on our defenses, we finally ended up having Izumi join us. As an ancient soldier of this planet, not only do we hope to have her help us protect her new home here and the clan as a whole, but of course we hope to learn more about her and her story and what this planet was like back when her or her faction roamed it freely. Now, after smashing up all those mechanoids, we had plenty of steel, and I mean plenty, but we also had a good bit of plasteel as well, so I thought it would be appropriate to have Rets begin making some armor. In particular, a brand new plasteel daimyo helmet, as well as some plasteel shoulder pauldrons. And the bearer of this brand new armor would be none other than Brick, gifted to him by Kono Yoshimaru herself. As many of you pointed out, rightfully so, last episode, Brick was a damn hero, and he should be treated as such with some type of promotion or reward. He has now been given the title and rank of daimyo. Apparently this is some type of landlord or powerful figure in Japanese history. I'm not too super familiar with it, but Brick is now one. This also felt like a good time to change Brick's name to Renga, which, as our friend Defcon1 puts it, is Brick but simply in Japanese, and I like that. A fitting name for our fitting hero. Rets really pulled his weight as well, so eventually we're going to give him a promotion or a reward too. But until we find a suitable reward, for now we're going to be focusing on other matters like researching sake brewing. Sake is not only a great way for our samurai to enjoy themselves, but it would also be a great way to make a little bit of money. So we have Rusty working on that research right away, but speaking of Rusty, it would appear that he is dependent on Psychite and we don't have any nearby. We do of course though have a nice field to plant some psychoid leaves in, and thus that's immediately one we would also begin working on as he is doing his research. That way we can make him some Psychite tea in the near future to keep him from dying. We would also end up building a very small brewing building, I suppose you could call it, more of a fermenting shed, and we threw our fermenting barrels in. Then I realized that we actually needed some specific ones for sake, so we built those instead. We began making the liquid that would need to ferment to become sake, but I realized that we need to be below a certain temperature. I didn't realize that sake had to be made in the cold like this, so looks like we'll be waiting until winter. But that's assuming we make it to winter, as we quite literally right now have the largest raid of Neanderthals coming to try to kill us that we have ever seen. This appeared to be an actual army of Neanderthal warriors. We wasted absolutely no time rushing to our defensive embrasures as well as our tanks, getting them out onto the battlefield and into position as soon as we could. But even then, the army was already upon us. Many of their warriors were creeping up on our defenses. Using the frontal cannons on our tanks though, we were able to stop them in their tracks. With such a dense group of tribal warriors all packed together like this, it was extremely easy, one might even say child's play, to run them all over. And realistically, at the end of the day, it only came down to what was tougher, our armor plating on the tanks or Neanderthal skulls, and it was actually quite close, believe it or not. But in the end, we had ran over so damn many of them that the remaining group decided to try to flee, which was quite surprising as well, because this group was very large still yet. But there was one in particular who showed quite a bit of promise, so we decided to begin tending to his wounds and we would end up taking him prisoner. As for the others, we would strip them of the gear that they currently had, and we ended up slaughtering them, yeah. The one that we hadn't decided to murder, though, ended up having a very good melee and plant skill with a burning passion in both. He was a slow learner, though, but we can work with that. His resistance wasn't all that high, so I would expect him to join us before too long. Now, I'm never going to say that I'm glad we had a massive raid, because if I did, then I would also be saying that I'm glad we got raided with the mercenaries and the mechanoids last episode, which damn near took us out. But in this particular raid, we ended up getting a lot of very simple weapons. Weapons that still cost money, though. And thus, because of that, we could load all these little weapons up into our tank and begin to head out to do a bit of trading, so we might be able to make a pretty penny on them. And by traveling to the Black Clan and selling them a bunch of weapons, not only are we making a good bit of money off of these weapons, but we are also strengthening our ties with them, as well as giving them weapons that will just make them stronger in general. It's quite literally a win-win-win-win-win situation. Now, the money that we're making from selling clubs and spears was nothing too spectacular, but added on to the amount of taxes that we had already been getting thus far, we would be able to settle many more villages. This time around, we ended up settling about 3 new villages, all of which are going to be hunting and logging villages, and that will be our primary export, it seems. We would also take a moment to go ahead and build a little steel shelf in our communications building for the Ruby Dragon Priest mask, as I didn't currently really have anywhere else to put it. I think I would maybe like to display it in some type of palace if we ever get one built. Shortly thereafter, though, we ended up recruiting Oxol, the Neanderthal that I was discussing a few moments ago, into our ranks. Naturally, we sent him into the warehouse to go ahead and equip some appropriate weapons and armor. I don't know if any of you have noticed, but I've been beginning to notice that most of our samurai clan is made up of impids, Neanderthals, and humans, while most other clans seems to simply be humans. We're very diverse here. I will say, even though Oxol looks pretty good in his new attire and with a new weapon, but he is missing a left leg, arm, his stomach, and his nose, making him very susceptible to death if we don't get some of these replaced. So I think next episode we're going to try to focus on making some clockwork and steamwork bionics, but as for now, this episode we are going to be focusing on conquering. Currently, right now, we're going to be attempting to capture 3 total villages, 2 of which are owned by the Impids, and one of them being owned by the Red Clan just south of our base. Just in case you're still a bit confused on this process and or this feature, this is part of the Empire mod, where we actually use our army at one of our villages to attack one of their villages. And as you can see, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, as we managed to capture the Red Clan village, but not the Impid villages. We went ahead and began building up some logging camps and deforestation camps in the one that we did actually capture, and then I got a little bit impatient and I would try attacking the 2 Impid villages once more. The success of our attacks normally depend on the size of the militaries that we're sending to try to capture these villages, and because ours are still quite small and basically a newborn nation, they're quite weak as well, and thus why we ended up not being able to capture these villages once more. Even without these 2, though, that we were attempting to capture with the one we did, as well as the new ones that we've recently settled, we managed to get our tax collection up to just over 8,000. But I'm afraid we don't let things go that easy, and we are a little bit stubborn, so thus we've decided to send out a manual party with our tanks to try and take over. Upon our arrival, though, this was an incredibly small village. I really couldn't believe that we had struggled to take it over this much, but I suppose when our military is maybe 1 or 2 weak samurai, it kinda makes sense. This place appeared to be something of a shrine, though. Perhaps some type of religious holy site for the Impids, but in the middle near their shrine, I noticed that there was yet another Dragon Priest mask. Strange, but really all that changes is we'll try not to hit it with our tank cannons. We immediately began opening up an absolute barrage of hellfire from our cannons, blowing off legs and crushing sternums. With Impids being so resistant resistant to fire. It's a good thing that we had boiling hot water to peel the flesh from their bones instead. Some of their more brave and or foolish warriors, of course, would try to get up close and personal with our tanks, which was an awful move on their part. Eventually, they would begin trying to flee the area, but of course, we would try to stop as many as we could. Well, with that, the battle was finally over, and we were finally victorious. We would then take the Dragon Priest mask and start getting the hell out of Dodge. Unfortunately, we wouldn't be able to salvage the village as it had completely burnt down from all the imped fire and cannon blast. But after finally returning home, we had been able to bring back plenty of food and resources, as well as many different types of weapons, so it wasn't a complete loss, and we did get rid of the village at the very least. I noticed that we had brought back a very unusual looking red sword that was known as a Muram Asa. It is apparently an adachi with an eerie red blade said to have been stained with the blood of all the lives that it has taken. It is also fabled to be a demonic blade with supernatural thirst for blood. Well, okay. Since Rhett basically looks like a demon being an impid, I thought it would be the perfect sword for him, and especially since he has already earn some type of reward, this just seemed fitting. Accompanied with the fact that such a legendary and fabled weapon should probably be wielded by someone who is an expert at melee. And before I forgot, we would also expand out our steel shelf and put the Jade Dragon Priest mask right next to our ruby one. We're really starting quite the collection of these, aren't we? Not exactly sure what they're good for other than some paperweights that look pretty, but perhaps they have a deeper meaning. Nonetheless though, we also decided to begin working on our defenses once more, this time in the northern section at the northern entrance and walls, once again just doubling up on our slate walls using our blocks that we've been cutting along with our slate embrasures. We also ended up building plenty of bear traps and natural pathing, that way we could try to get rid of any frustrating vegetation that's getting in the way. A good bit of time later and we had collected quite a few tax payments. Using this money we would actually settle 2 more brand new villages near where the previous impede tribe actually was, that we had destroyed, of course. I waited for the coast to be a bit clearer and the area to be a bit safer before doing so, that way we didn't have any issues. Now currently these 2 new villages, of course, are extremely small, very low populations, and thus not that many workers or buildings like logging camps or mines or anything like that. And even so though, we're getting close to almost 10,000 silver per tax round, which is really good. In the future, these payments will only stand to help us further expand our empire even larger, but also speed up the expansion of the empire in general. We have created our very own Shogun Empire, the Lazarian Shogunate, of course. We have some very big plans on the very near horizon. With an empire like this forming, the possibilities are damn near limitless. Once we actually begin upgrading the sizes of these villages and thus upgrading the sizes of their militaries, it'll be extremely easy for us to start taking over many other types of enemy settlements, whether it be the Space Mercenaries, the Impids, or the Red Clan. Now, the mercenaries themselves with their advanced technology are most likely going to be the hardest of them all to try to take over, but if we could maybe try to overwhelm them with sheer numbers, I definitely think it's something we could do, let alone if we could manage to maybe unite the blue and black clans to assist us in this endeavor. I think we could do it for sure. That very well could be asking a little bit too much from those clans though, but we shall see in the future, I suppose. Let me know if you guys have any suggestions for maybe ways we could try to unite them, or if you have any ideas in general what would make this process a bit easier for taking over the planet. And of course, if you have any name suggestions for our people, our samurai, our animals, or any of our tanks or anything like that, or any mods, be sure to leave that in the comment section as always. But I love you guys, I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.